Hello, thanks for joining me. I'm at Blaenwaun Chapel near St Dogmaels in Pembrokeshire. There's a lot of history here. This chapel was founded in the early 18th century. Then the members met in a house. They built a small thatched meeting house in the mid-18th century, rebuilt that in 1795, and it was rebuilt again as we see it now in 1885. The present building is by a London architect, a local boy made good. It's a story of boom and bust, and many ministers, one of whom went completely off the rails and got excommunicated, of which more later. Blaenwaun also has an enormous, really enormous, burial ground. It was extended in the early 19th century and paid for by a former minister, David Rees of Froghole, who was buried at another chapel which he founded, Bethlehem, though his wife and children were buried here in the land which he gave. This print of the old chapel shows it was a long wall entry chapel and it had a gallery. Even before the new chapel was built, the burial ground was very full. When it was built, the old chapel had accommodation for 237 members who came from no less than 14 neighbouring parishes. A second chapel, Tir Bont, was built near St Dogmaels in 1813, and that was replaced later by Bethsaida. In 1859, a revival swelled the numbers. Blaenwaun's congregation grew and baptisms were frequent. At one point, no less than 43 new members were baptised at once. Many ministers served this place. The famous Baptist minister Titus Lewis was baptised and ordained here. David Phillips was an early minister. He sailed to New Brunswick on the Active of Cardigan in 1822 and bought land there. He was hoping to stay, but after the death of two of his daughters, he returned to Blaenwaun. He's buried here, and this grand monument, costing £14 and 14 shillings, was paid for by the congregation. Preaching was, of course, central to the life of the chapel. So important, in fact, that in 1815, during the sermon at an ordination service, when a woman dropped dead in the gallery, she was discreetly taken outside while the sermon went on. Some ministers proved problematic and were removed and excommunicated. The first of these was Richard Davis. He was considered weak. He liked hanging out with his friends too much, and he was doctrinally suspect. The second rogue minister was Seth Jones. Born in 1848 at Anglesey, he was the son of a poultry dealer. He'd come to Haverfordwest to train as a Baptist minister, and in 1871, at the tender age of only 23, he was given the tremendous responsibility of being minister of Blaenwaun and Bethsaida. His predecessor, Isaac Thomas of Birkenhead, had been a steady middle-aged man and had left to take on another chapel in Glamorgan. In August 1879, Seth's younger brother had left Haverfordwest College and become pastor of a Baptist church in Rumney. Seth attended his ordination service, but very soon both men would be out of their chapels. A few months before Evan's ordination, Seth and his wife had lost their only child. 10-month-old Elizabeth was buried in the chapel yard at Blaenwaun. Fate was not kind to Seth Jones. A year later, his wife Mary was laid in the same grave after a huge funeral attended by scores of ministers from miles around. Much sympathy was extended to Seth, but words of comfort were clearly not enough to steady the young minister. He hit the bottle. In a period and area where temperance was most certainly a virtue, a drunken minister was on dangerous ground. Seth knew this. His brother Evan had also been fond of the demon drink and had lost his job in Rumney as a result. What followed then is illustrative of the desperate state of mind Seth Jones was in. In the summer of 1882, he travelled to Haverfordwest, the place he and his brother had gone to college. He got drunk, and he went to a brothel. He might have got away with it had he not then gone to the police station to report that a lady of ill fame had taken his half-sovereign and kept it. It would have cost him less than it did had he let her keep it. The police declined to take the matter any further, but the story leaked and reached the ears of the Reverend Principal of Haverfordwest Baptist College, who wrote, as he felt he had to the deacons of Blaenwaun. They knew about Seth's drinking already. In fact, they'd been trying to keep a lid on it. But this was worse. To be fair to them, they did go to Haverfordwest to ascertain the truth of the matter before they deprived him of his living and excommunicated him. It was reported in the newspapers. They had little choice. In the space of 3 years, Seth Jones had lost his only child, his wife, his job, and his reputation. He left the area. He got the pastorate of a chapel in Treharris. I can't believe he went with a letter of recommendation. Anyway, he didn't stay long, and then he left Wales altogether and travelled in New Zealand and Australia and settled down to become the successful minister of Newcastle Baptist Chapel in New South Wales in 1884. He came back to Wales in 1892, visited many Baptist chapels, bore no ill will towards the elders of Blaenwaun, and was in fact received warmly there. He died after surgery in Australia, aged only 56, in July 1904, having twice been president of the Baptist Union. He was buried in the Baptist section of Sandgate General Cemetery, but is also remembered here on the memorial to his wife and daughter. All, it seems, had been forgiven, despite the notoriety. After his death, his brother Evan, who had left Wales for America, became pastor of Newcastle Baptist Tabernacle in his stead. The chapel Seth Jones left in disgrace was not the same one he returned to on his visit to Wales. It had been rebuilt, and it was many times larger. Old Blaenwaun Chapel was pulled down and rebuilt by the grandson of the man who had built it. Chapel architects are sometimes anonymous, but here we have a plaque naming him. He also contributed to the building by paying £50 and gave his services as architect for free, though I suspect his assistant did most of the site work. Both men were born here. Owen Lewis was a local boy who learned the building trade and then made his fortune in London. He was naturally a Baptist and designed the striking London Welsh Baptist Chapel and the Corinthian Bazaar, the facade of which survives as the front of the London Palladium. He retired first to Gloucestershire and then came to end his days in Wales, in Ferryside in Carmarthenshire, where he died in 1905. He was a poet as well as an architect, known by the bardic name Cwmdegwel, a prominent member of the London Welsh community and a guardian of the Welsh language. He was present at the opening of the chapel and gave a speech. The chapel cost an enormous sum to build, £1,800. Materials were carted for free by the local farmers to try and keep the costs down. It's as big as a town chapel, but here it stands in a fairly remote spot. It's not particularly beautiful. A contemporary report said no attempt has been made at architectural display. It hadn't. It was not designed to show off. It was designed to be practical, with a heavy emphasis on seating capacity and modern ventilation technology. The stained glass window between the lobby and the body of the chapel, for example, is not fixed but hinged at the top to allow airflow. The pulpit platform is made of cast iron, pitched pine and mahogany with a plaster arch on the end wall to frame it. The cast iron pillars holding up the gallery are painted to match the timber. It's all very brown. It must have seemed a great improvement on the previous old chapel, which had the pulpit on the long wall with windows either side, an oak table, benches in the gallery, but no fixed seats downstairs. People brought chairs from their homes. It also accommodated a growing congregation. It had nearly 600 members at the turn of the century. It has nothing like that now, and I'm sure the maintenance costs must be enormous and onerous. Its daughter chapels of Bethsaida and Gerazim have been sold off. The outdoor baptism pool between Blaenwaun and Bethsaida probably rarely sees a baptism, but once it was filled with large numbers of people watching baptisms of many all at once. It's rather sad now, but it is a listed building, which this chapel is not. The burial ground still has space. It was the place of rest for the members of the chapels of Blaenwaun, Gerazim and Bethsaida. Rules dating from 1898 state no cross-shaped monument or gravestones with crosses on were allowed. There don't seem to have been any before the rule came in, except this one exception, which dates from 1889 and may have caused objections and brought the rule about. Blaenwaun Chapel has a long and proud history and had such a large membership that many people can trace their ancestors to this chapel or to one of its associated chapels. Perhaps you can too. If so, feel free to mention it in the comments. I hope you found its history interesting. Please remember to hit the like button, and as always, thank you for watching.